This is honey, which you're probably familiar with. And this is molasses, which may be more of a mystery to you. Today I'm going to explain the similarities and the differences between these two sweet, syrupy substances so you know which to use and why. Hello and welcome to I Want to Cook. My name is Chef Matt and this channel is all about helping you be a better cook no matter your skill level. And today we are turning our focus on two interesting pantry items, honey and molasses. And like I said in that intro, they are both similar and different from each other. Now, before we talk about their differences, let's talk about their similarities. And for the most part, both of these are sweet. And that makes them great for uses like desserts and baking, but they can also be used in savory dishes when you want to add some contrast. Another similarity is that they are both thick and syrupy. If you've ever put honey on bread or something like that, you know that it can be really thick and sometimes you have to squeeze that bottle to get it out. Well, it's the same thing with molasses. It's got a real thick, syrupy nature to it. Another thing they have in common is they are both emulsifiers. Now, if you're not sure what an emulsifier is when we're talking about food, all that is it's an ingredient that brings two otherwise contrasting ingredients together. One of the best examples is oil and vinegar. Those two ingredients don't usually get along, but when you add an emulsifier, well, they do. Have you ever had two friends that don't really get along very well, but when you hang out with both of them, they do? Well, honey and molasses are both emulsifiers, and that means all three can get along when one of them is together. In the case of a vinaigrette, if you add either of these two, it's going to add stability and it's going to let that vinaigrette be nice and cohesive, nice and consistent. Now, as I mentioned, both of these are sweet, but they also have uses in savory applications. That's a great way to add contrast to a dish. Whether that's like a marinade or something like baked beans, you can use either of these in savory dishes for a nice hint of sweetness in the background. And finally, both of these are great pantry items because you can put them in kind of a cool, dark place in your pantry and they'll be just fine. They don't necessarily need refrigeration, and that means that they can both store well. Now, first of all, let's talk about honey. You're probably familiar with honey, but just in case you aren't, here's a quick recap. Honey, of course, comes from bees. They take the nectar of plants and they produce honey out of that. That's kind of what nourishes them, and well, it might be nourishing you. Now, if you've ever shopped for honey, you know that there's a wide variety of types. There's different flavors, there's different kinds. You can go to just about any supermarket and find a wide variety of different types of honey at different price points. Now, one thing to know about honey is that it is not vegan. So if you are thinking about going on a vegan diet, well, honey is not vegan. Remember, it comes from bees, which are an animal. Now, you probably know honey because it has this nice kind of amber color, and honey is a really good ingredient in beverages, either hot or cold. One of the best examples is tea. Putting a nice big dollop of honey in tea, that is just really good. It's kind of soothing on the throat, and it's nice and sweet. And finally, honey is really good as a condiment, as a topping. You can drizzle it on sundaes, cornbread, whatever. That's a really good way to use honey for a nice touch of sweetness. Now let's talk about this stuff, molasses. Molasses is actually a byproduct of sugar production, either sugar cane or sugar beets. And what happens is when sugar is being produced, there's this method of boiling it. And one of the byproducts of boiling is molasses. Now, molasses actually comes in a few different grades, and they all have to do with that boiling process. So what comes off the first boiling is what's called light molasses. What comes off the second boiling is dark molasses. And then finally, the third boiling of sugar gets you blackstrap molasses. And that is the most kind of pungent molasses that there is. And sometimes molasses is actually part of sugar. If you've ever had brown sugar, for instance, well, all brown sugar is sugar with molasses in it. That's what makes it brown. And while those are the three main types of molasses, that's basically it. It just doesn't have the variety that honey does. And if you go to a local store, you might only find one. This was all that was available at several stores that I checked. Just this kind of lighter molasses. If you want something like blackstrap molasses, you might have to shop at like a health food store or just go online. Now, as for where to find this stuff in your supermarket, you might have to do a little bit of hunting. It might be in the baking section, or in the case where I'm at, it was actually next to like the syrups that you would put on pancakes along with corn syrup for baking. Now, while you can use molasses as a condiment similar to honey, it's really better in cooked dishes, like when you're baking something or making a marinade out of it. It just really adds a nice kind of a deep flavor. And let's talk about that flavor. As you know, honey is really sweet, sometimes cloyingly so. But molasses, especially depending on the grade, has more of a kind of a complex taste to it. There's sweetness for sure, but there's also a hint of bitterness. Even more so as you go darker. So the darker molasses is less sweet, and then the blackstrap molasses, that can almost border on bitter. Now, you might see on the label either sulfured or unsulfured molasses, and sulfur is used in some of the kind of lower grade qualities of making molasses, and I would just go for unsulfured. I think that's going to taste better. It's going to be kind of a higher grade. You might also see something like pomegranate molasses, and in truth, that's not really a molasses per se. It's more of like a reduction sauce. When you reduce something and you get that kind of thick, syrupy sauce, it's not really a molasses per se. It's kind of a molasses in name only, but it can be delicious as well. But don't confuse something like pomegranate molasses with true molasses. Now, unlike honey, molasses is vegan. It comes from either sugar cane or sugar beets, which of course are not animals, so that makes it vegan and a great use if you are following a vegan diet. Another difference with molasses is that it does have some nutrients to it. Now, granted, you're probably not going to be eating either of these things for their nutritional value, but molasses is relatively high in things like B vitamins and iron. And finally, I think molasses is just a little more interesting. Like I said, it's got kind of a complex taste. It's got that complex flavor that's kind of sweet, kind of bitter. It's really interesting. Now, of course, I use both of these in cooking, depending on what I am cooking. But next time you're making something like baked beans, throw some molasses in there. Next time you're making a vinaigrette or a marinade, maybe instead of using honey, throw in some molasses. I think it's going to give it a really nice kind of a deep flavor, and I would love to hear what you think. You can start with something simple. For example, I've been using molasses when I make oatmeal in the mornings, and I've also been adding it to my breakfast bars. And I'll put the video on how to make that in the description below. But what I've been doing with the breakfast bars is I've been about having some of the sugar content and putting molasses instead, and it gives it a nice deep flavor. So there's a little primer of honey versus molasses. I hope you found this helpful. Let me know, what do you use and what do you use these for? Put that in the comments below. Hey, as always, thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you are new to the channel, welcome. Welcome to my kitchen. I am so glad that you are here. Until next time, I hope you want to cook. Today, I'm going to explain the similarities and differences between these two sweet, syrupy... It's hard to say.